China has long been a big partner for African nations in trade and investment. But now, Beijing is moving deeper, into weapons and defense. And the shift is clear in the Sahel, where Chinese guns, trucks, and rockets are making their way in. Recently, Burkina Faso's army received a huge delivery of Chinese-made military vehicles, heavy guns, and rocket systems. A country that once relied on France and the US has turned toward the east, and the battlefield in the Sahel may never look the same again. In August 2025, the usually calm streets of Ouagadougou shook with the roar of engines and the sight of something West Africa rarely sees. Brand new Chinese military trucks, rocket launchers, and artillery systems rolling into army bases under heavy guard. This wasn't rumor or propaganda. Video footage confirmed endless lines of fresh military hardware, all painted in desert camouflage. Soldiers stood proudly, while engineers prepared the machines for battle. For Burkina Faso, this was more than a delivery. It was proof of a break from the West and a step into a new military era. The most eye-catching vehicles were the big armored carriers, trucks built to take heavy fire while firing back with powerful guns that can hit moving targets even while driving. For an army that once relied on old pickup trucks and second-hand vehicles, seeing these machines roll in was almost unreal. Alongside them came new mobile cannons that can fire shells at long range like mortars, but also switch to direct fire in close combat. For soldiers used to old exposed artillery, this flexibility was a game changer. And then there were the rocket systems. Each truck could launch rockets that travel up to 70 kilometers, guided or unguided. For the first time, Burkina Faso now has long-range strike power. Militants hiding deep in remote camps, once safe from retaliation, now face the threat of rockets raining down from afar. The psychological impact alone changes the battlefield. This wasn't the first Chinese delivery. Previous shipments had included mine-resistant trucks, troop carriers, and supply vehicles. But the August 2025 shipment stood out for its size, its advanced technology, and its very public display. Unlike before, this time Burkina Faso didn't try to hide it. They showed the world that their army is no longer fighting with scraps. The timing is telling. Western military support has been shrinking. France pulled out, the US scaled down, and promises of international aid rarely translated into weapons on the ground. Into that vacuum stepped China, not with words, but with steel. But modern weapons are only as good as the soldiers using them. Training is essential. These trucks, rockets, and cannons need skilled crews, new tactics, and disciplined logistics. Otherwise, they risk being more of a showpiece than a real advantage. Yet, China seems to be going beyond just selling equipment, offering training and support to ensure the weapons actually get used. For Burkina Faso, this shipment marks a turning point. An army once seen as weak and under-equipped now holds tools that rival or surpass many of its neighbors. Militants who once ambushed convoys may soon face armored columns armed with heavy guns and long-range rockets. But the question remains, will firepower alone change the war's outcome? To understand why Burkina Faso turned to China, we need to step back. Since 2015, insurgencies have burned through the country, especially in the north and east. Villages destroyed, government posts overrun, and millions of people displaced. By 2024, almost 2 million citizens were forced from their homes. The army was stretched thin and under-equipped. Militants used motorbikes and pickups to strike quickly, disappearing before soldiers could react. Old rifles and outdated vehicles were no match. Every time the army seemed to regain ground, insurgents shifted tactics, forcing soldiers into a cycle of constant defense. That's why the new systems feel like lifelines. The armored trucks give protection on open roads. The mobile cannons let commanders shell enemy bases from safety and then fight directly if needed. The rocket systems deny insurgents the ability to hide in remote areas. Together, they offer hope that the army can finally take the initiative instead of always reacting. But there's also a bigger question. Why China and not the West? For decades, Burkina Faso relied heavily on France for security. But Paris often dictated the terms, tying support to politics, economics, and loyalty. As French forces failed to stop insurgents, anger grew. By 2022, protests filled the streets. French troops were expelled. The U.S. could have filled the gap, but its aid was limited, full of conditions, and too slow. For a country under daily attack, waiting for Washington's approval felt impossible. China, by contrast, offers speed, volume, and no political strings. It doesn't demand reforms or attach aid to elections. For the government in Ouagadougou, that was far more attractive. Where the West talks, China delivers. This wasn't just about weapons, it was symbolic. By openly showing Chinese convoys, Burkina Faso declared it was no longer tied to Western masters. It was choosing its partners on its own terms. And Burkina Faso isn't alone. Mali is working with Russia. Niger is exploring Turkish and Chinese options. A whole new block of countries is emerging, post-Western, looking east. For China, this goes far beyond selling weapons. Arms deals open the door to training, supply chains, and long-term partnerships. Once an army relies on Chinese equipment, it's tied to Beijing for spare parts, maintenance, and future upgrades. In other words, China secures influence for decades. But how is Burkina Faso paying for all this? With one of the lowest GDPs in the world, the question matters. The answer: creative deals. China often structures payments flexibly, through loans, delayed payments, or resource-backed arrangements. In Burkina Faso's case, gold is likely the key. As one of Africa's top gold producers, the government may have promised future gold revenues in exchange for weapons today. This model isn't new. China has done it before in Angola and the Congo, trading weapons or infrastructure for oil and minerals. It lets struggling states arm themselves now while pushing payments into the future. Critics warn this risks mortgaging the country's future. But supporters argue survival today outweighs tomorrow's debt. For Burkina Faso's leaders, the choice is clear: either arm now or risk collapse. At home, these new weapons also strengthen the government politically. Citizens see visible proof that the state is rearming. Soldiers regain confidence. The message is clear: the state is no longer helpless. Still, this shift raises deeper questions. What does it mean for the Sahel and for Africa's future? For decades, France and the West dominated this region's security. Now, the landscape is changing. Burkina Faso's deal with China is the clearest sign yet that the Sahel is no longer a Western stronghold. Mali has Russian contractors. Niger is exploring Turkish and Chinese drones. Burkina Faso now fields Chinese rocket systems. Together, these nations are testing whether they can secure themselves without the West. For the West, this is a blow. France's credibility is shattered. The U.S. looks hesitant, and China has stepped in, fast and effectively. That efficiency sends a strong message across Africa. When the West retreats, China delivers. For insurgents, the game is changing. They once thrived on weak armies with old weapons. Now, long-range rockets and armored trucks threaten their safe havens. They'll adapt, but the balance of fear may begin to shift. But military strength alone won't solve everything. Poverty, marginalization, and weak governance still fuel the insurgency. Rockets can destroy camps, but they can't rebuild trust with citizens. Even so, for Burkina Faso, the decision was about survival and choice. It's not about trading one master for another, but about refusing to be left defenseless while waiting for Western approval. This is bigger than Burkina Faso. It's about Africa at a crossroads. Will Chinese weapons stabilize the Sahel or create new dependency? That's the debate. But one thing is certain. The Chinese convoys rolling into Burkina Faso weren't just carrying weapons. They were carrying a message. A new era is here. The rules of the game are changing, and this time Africa is choosing its own course. Has Burkina Faso just triggered the biggest power shift in Sahel's history? Will Chinese weapons finally turn the tide against insurgencies? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, about the untold black story and the untold side of world events, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.